Hello, everyone. Welcome to this press conference this Friday with the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock. Minister, you have the floor. Hello to everyone. The original planning said this was the day this climate conference would end, and I think all of us have the experience or wisdom to prepare a suitcase for a longer stay, because we know that the negotiations take time. They are still ongoing. Negotiators are working at full speed, and some points are still much disputed. Positions are still far apart in some fields. Our stance is clear. This climate conference must not be a lost climate conference. COP needs a result for international climate protection, because the gap to the 1.5-degree path is still far too wide. The efforts we need to close this gap are still not substantial enough. So we have made it very clear as the EU that if this is a conference for implementation, we will make the case for implementation until the very last minute. We will do everything we can. All states have gathered here. They traveled here 2 weeks ago to get things going together. And now you have to decide whether you want to leave and say, yes, we did everything we could to reach a result, or whether you have to admit that you have missed an opportunity. The EU is ready for an agreement, and we have made very concrete proposals in the negotiations. And let me be very clear. These are negotiations about important, substantial topics. So I want to be very frank. You can fall back into old reflexes and see it as a black and white matter. And yes, it's true. There were times when industrialized nations, and maybe my country, probably also my country, not did everything they could to close the gap to the 1.5-degree path. And when it comes to climate financing, we still haven't reached the point or the stage where we should be. But the European Union has, especially last year and the year before, and we as a German government have not only realized that times need to change, but we also started the necessary legislation for that. As the Federal Republic of Germany, we have defined our own national goal and have advanced it as the new government. We have advanced the goal that we had signed up to in Paris. And as the European Union, we said, we see how much the world is falling apart right now. We see that there are states that have not 1 minute left to wait for an agreement. So we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with the most vulnerable. So as the EU and within the framework of the EU, Germany also acts within the EU, we traveled here with 2 clear messages. We want to deliver in order to close the gap to the 1.5-degree pathway, and we want to deliver when it comes to climate financing. This is why already in the run-up to the conference, we made the case for loss and damage to be put on the agenda for this COP. And we have said very clearly that we need to do more to reach the 1.5-degree path. We don't want to embellish things here. The next 10 years are decisive for whether the 1.5-degree path will still be within reach. So the working program on mitigation is the second most important key factor at this climate conference. And we have made very concrete proposals in that regard. I would like to be very clear. They are binding first and foremost for us, because we know that since 2015, since the Paris Agreement, we haven't done enough in terms of mitigation, but especially because we are saying very clearly these goals are binding, especially for us ourselves. I also want to be clear. Nobody can hide between the EU or shift the blame to the EU. when you are against the proposals for mitigation efforts and annual reports, when you're against saying the next years until 2030 are decisive, then you also have to say why you are against this. You can no longer just take the position that you're against this because the industrialized nations wouldn't want to contribute. No, this is a goal that is binding first and foremost for us. And this, so we have proposed a work program for emissions reductions by 2030 with annual reports and a political process that helps to monitor process in detail. A work program that makes it very clear that all sectors need to deliver, from transport to industry to fiscal policy. We want to do this together. We want to write this down together because we saw what happened nationally in the last years here. It's very easy to play off one sector against the other. Then the energy sector will say, okay, we have done everything we could and we'll stop here. And then the transport sector says, okay, we will use the remaining budget for ourselves. But we don't have this time, and especially the most vulnerable countries don't have that time. So we, as the EU, in the full awareness that this is about our own responsibilities and obligations, because it is up to the industrialized nations, according to the Paris Agreement, that who have to make the major emissions reductions by 2030. So we want to decide a joint work program together. And those countries that are not yet willing to talk about this path towards emissions reductions in a clear and transparent manner have to ask themselves what it means if we cannot halve the emissions by 2030. That is the big task. But what would a failure mean? What global impacts would that have? Today is the moment in which we have to ask ourselves honestly, what are the impacts for my own country in the coming years, but also what are the impacts for my neighboring country or a country that is hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, but does not have the financial means to adapt to the financial consequences and the new situation. The pathway up to 2030 will be decisive on whether we can keep the 1.5-degree path within reach. At the same time, mitigation is nothing you can play off against financing. This is also a discussion we've seen again and again in the past, playing off one thing against the other. But as the international community, we can only reach the 1.5-degree path together, and we will only be able to reach our goals with a combination of climate financing and mitigation. Even if we decided on the strongest mitigation efforts, loss and damage is already a reality in many countries. We cannot just use a magic wand to get rid of them. So we need more funds for adaptation and for loss and damage. And at the same time, it is also true that no money on earth could reverse loss and damage in the future if we do not agree on a substantial mitigation program now, because a 3 or 4-degree world in the coming decades or at the end of the century would be devastating. So for us as the Federal Republic of Germany, we are very clear. The 100 billion goal for climate financing needs to be a bedrock, and we have to live up to our obligations. Yes, we are running late. We will keep our promise to commit 6 billion euros by 2025 from our budget. Of course, we will implement that. But public money alone will not be sufficient. We need trillions in order to cope with loss and damage in the future. For that, we also need private investors. The money is here. It exists in this world. And why shouldn't we use these financial means together if the money is here? But we need to channel it wisely. This is why we're also making the case for a fund of the international financial system. And you also could see who made proposals here. There is a new group of countries that are really thinking about how we can address these central questions of the future together. So the World Bank does not only need to focus on individual states, but also on global crises. We believe this is necessary. And the biggest crisis is the climate crisis. And if some countries are hit hard by a climate event, for a stable economy, even for a stable economy, it is very difficult to cope with that. So we need to talk about this. What does this mean? You can't just pay high interest rates in such a situation to even get money. When you talk about money, however, you also must not remain silent about debt. It is the weakest states that can hardly bear their debt burden and are almost crushed by the multiple crises happening at the same time. So we are also advocating for finding common solutions when it comes to debt and fix common standards. Unfortunately, we've also seen in this field that some countries would like to continue to play by their own rules here, do not want to talk to one another, or, as creditors, prefer to talk to others behind closed doors. So at this point, I would like to appeal to everybody to really think about what it means if that method was to prevail in the future. What does that mean for my own country when a climate crisis was to hit my own country, and no country in this world can be sure that it won't suffer from severe climate events. This is why at this COP, there were many questions related to that, and I'm, of course, happy to take questions. We have made proposals that bring together the whole complexity. We made proposals for how to cope with loss and damage, how to provide quickly effective support for those countries affected immediately by the climate crisis. We want solutions that help the most vulnerable states now in concrete terms, and not only in a few years' time. That explicitly includes the possibility of a fund. Franz Timmermans made that clear as the EU negotiator. He made this clear yesterday, once more yesterday. We want the states who really need it to benefit, and not states that are developing countries only on paper nowadays. It is about concrete countries, and it is about people living in those countries. What we are deciding here is not just a piece of paper. It is about saving people's lives. And this is why we need to channel the money in a way that it reaches those who need it most. It is about countries such as Palau, where hospitals and residential buildings have to be relocated, or Niger, where we see aridification and desertified surfaces. People can no longer feed their families. And the question of who will pay for damage cannot be addressed according to a system that has been created 30 years ago. We need to shape it in a way that corresponds to the world that we have today. And within the EU, we are also willing to overcome obstacles to get to a solution swiftly in all areas, in mitigation, in financing, and especially in supporting the most vulnerable. In the coming, probably not minutes, but hours, we will see whether it takes days. We will see whether others are willing to take these steps too, moving out of the comfort zone where we might have negotiated for many years now, and really acknowledge the complexity of the situation today and focus on the simple question all this is about in the end: do everything we can to reach the 1.5-degree path, doing everything we can to help the most vulnerable. Germany and Europe stand shoulder to shoulder with the most vulnerable states. Others can show with whom they stand. So we will continue to work for concrete results, because the world cannot afford to lose another year in its efforts for climate protection. But I also want to be very clear here. Whereas then no result would be a result that would weaken, water down, or even turn back the consensus we had reached in Glasgow and Paris. We as the European Union cannot let this happen. So this will be an intensive day, and probably an intensive night as well. We still have a long way to go, but none of the open questions is unsolvable if we honestly want to make progress together for the sake of all of us. Thank you. Thank you. We have time to take some questions. Ms. Herzog, DPA, wants to ask a question. How was the EU proposal on loss and damage received? Do you have a first feedback? And how confident are you that the hopes that you have expressed recently that there will be a result that does not fall behind the results of Glasgow and Paris, and by when can such results be expected? Well, the last part of your question, I don't know, as soon as possible is something you would say as a diplomat, but I would also say as long as it takes for us to reach a good result. I think yesterday some of you, and this has been in the news, of course, Franz Timmermans made the proposal and people in the room showed that there might be support. Of course, we continued negotiations today, and I met with representatives of small island states recently, and we had spoken to them before. We had said that we wanted to put this topic on the agenda, and they have expressed that it is so important for them that we act now and that we focus on those who need this support most. And this is why I addressed this so clearly. Up to now, we have negotiated in procedures where we had blocks that had been formed a longer time ago, I think. And I think there are many who feel, as we do, that we can reach a good result in the interest of the most vulnerable, and that it is up to each and every one of us whether we really can reach that outcome. Mr. Denkler? Ms. Baerbock, could you talk to the big players? Have you received signals showing you that this could go well? Or are you completely uncertain about what the outcome will be here? Well, you should never be completely uncertain as a person. But of course, we have big doubts, and this is why I made this very clear. It's not a no-brainer. And this is why not only today, but also yesterday night, we had intensive discussions with those for whom we feel it is important that they move forward. And we felt in different working groups that when you really talk to people, sometimes it appears that problems lie in a different area. So it's not only about financing climate-induced loss and damage, but also what does it mean to globally finance infrastructure, energy infrastructure? This is decisive for countries to phase out fossil fuels and use renewable energies. If there are dependencies or if new dependencies are being created, that can be a problem because they bind these countries in a different way. Ms. Baerbock, you said the EU is ready. If this were to fail, it would be whose fault? Can you tell us? Well, we will see when we are at that point. Okay, right now, I am advocating for no one to be guilty, but to reach consensus. This is not about finger pointing or finding a scapegoat. It is about reaching consensus together. This is what national policies is about. This is what happens in every family. I mean, you will never agree 100%. Otherwise, we would all do the same things, say the same things, and eat the same things. But we have a common understanding of values. We come together under the auspices of the United Nations. We have the common understanding that we as the international community need to do everything we can to secure peace worldwide. And the climate crisis is a threat to the international order, international peace. It is the biggest security threat of the century. And on this basis, I believe that if we really are aware of this, that we can reach agreement, if we really want it, that's the point, that's the road to go.
Thank you, Kalita Clark, Financial Times. If China does not agree to pay into a new loss and damage funding facility, will Germany and the EU continue to support such a facility?
We have made a proposal making it clear that for us it is essential that especially the most vulnerable countries can benefit from this, because we have seen other financial funds, and it's not an end in itself. That people can say, okay, we paid some money into that fund. It only makes sense if the money really goes to those who need it most and for whom this was designed. And we saw that we have had other funds, because we might have thought, okay, it's not so important how the method then works. We only need to reach a compromise. But then money does not really arrive where it is most needed and what it was designed for. And that's the ambition we have as the EU. And this is why we have made it very clear when we don't want to create some fund and then see what will happen with that. No, when we create a fund that is part of a broader financial system, we want this fund to be available to the most vulnerable. And we know that if we want to help the most vulnerable states, that this requires a lot of money. So if we give a promise now, we help those who are threatened most by climate disasters. For some, it's already a reality. Others, we cannot even imagine today. It is a question of justice that we use all financial means available for that purpose. So it is important for us to make it very clear: to cope with the loss and damage of this climate disaster, we need different financial tools. And the third point, because we are talking about climate justice here, yes, I think it is also a question of justice that industrialized nations that are responsible for global warming until today are priority contributors to loss and damage financing. But if we were to create a financial system where we say it doesn't matter whether countries have committed to ambitious mitigation pathways or not, because they don't have to pay for the loss and damage of the future, it would be giving wrong incentives. We need to support the countries that are saying we do everything we can for active mitigation and reduction of emissions, and tell other countries who are not willing to reach the 1.5 degree that then it is their own responsibility in the future to pay for that damage. And this is why, with regard to loss and damage, we advocate for a financing system that includes the biggest emitters, and that especially with a view to the future, because we all have an interest in substantially reducing emissions. We know how tremendous this task is, and we can only do that together. We have time for one last question. Bernhard Pötter. Thank you. Two brief questions. The first is, did the EU consult with other countries or groups of countries before that it made that proposal, or was that something that was developed only by the EU? Have you talked to others before or not? And the second question, inclusion of the most vulnerable and a broader donor base, are these the red lines that are non-negotiable in this story? Did I get Mr. Timmermans correctly here? Well, defining red lines at press conferences would not be the best strategy to follow, but you understood Mr. Timmermans correctly. For us, a fund, and I tried to make that clear in my remarks, and also when I answered to the question before, it is not an end in itself. Spending money is not an end in itself. This is about making sure there is climate justice, because we see that among the those who suffer most from loss and damage are those who have contributed least to climate change. And then we need a fund for the future to make sure that when climate disasters hit individual countries so much that it threatens their own existence and that they cannot act anymore, that we will have something at our hands. We cannot just let a country drown. We cannot just let a an economy go into bankruptcy because of a natural disaster. This is a damage to a country that cannot be made up for. So we want to build a fund that has such scenarios in mind and can act very quickly. So this is why we have launched these two parameters in the discussion. And of course, beforehand, and not only 2 weeks ago, but when we met at the Petersberg Climate Dialogue, there were individual representatives present, so we discussed that topic already then. And when you have smaller formats like this one, it's also helpful not having 1,000 cameras around. We talk to different actors, small and big players. We spoke about how we can move forward with loss and damage. We did not do so in a confrontative way, but with the spirit of developing ideas together for good results. We brought these ideas to the climate conference, and you talked about readjusting ideas. I think it is really a strength to have discussions where you can really feel that there are points that are so important to others. And then you cannot just say, well, we came here 2 weeks ago with a different idea and we won't budge. We are not willing to factor in what others want. So yesterday night, as the EU, we have made another proposal with a focus on this term of a fund is explicitly mentioned, more explicitly than in our original proposal, because for many it has been important to say, okay, we know what this term means. And at the same time, we have made clear what our own concern was. When you say fund, people think we will copy something that we did 30 years ago, but this would be a mistake. So this is why yesterday night we spelled out what our fund really is and that it is part of a broader system. And let me come back to the working program. This is just as essential at the climate conference. We see that exchange is so important. We are negotiating here over 2 weeks. That helps to overcome misunderstandings, to really understand what our counterparts think. And many countries had the same interest, doing everything we can to use this COP as a COP of implementation with clear reductions of emissions and at the same time show more solidarity with the most vulnerable. Thank you very much. Thank you. The minister has to go to the next meeting. We will see you back soon. Thank you.